Would these 5 famous people have benefited from an ADHD diagnosis? I spent a kind of embarrassing amount of time looking into this. Let's start with one that actually surprised me. Pablo Picasso hated school. He couldn't sit still, he couldn't concentrate. He spent all his class time drawing and cutting up paper figures. Once, a teacher let him bring a live pigeon into class to draw just so he'd stay in his seat. His first word was pencil. He was preoccupied with art to the detriment of everything else from the earliest age. On the surface, this kind of sounds like ADHD. Kid can't focus, can't sit still, only cares about one thing. But pay attention to the why. He didn't hate school because his brain couldn't take the structure. He hated school because it wasn't art. At age 13, he completed an art school entrance exam that usually takes a month to complete in 1 week. At 16, he enrolled in Spain's top art school, but almost immediately stopped attending classes because he hated the formal instruction. Think about what art school is. It's not just painting. It's art history, theory, technique, all that academic stuff around the thing. And he didn't want any of it. He wanted to make things. Everything else was a distraction. And here's what's interesting, considering we're talking about ADHD. He didn't like distractions. This was a boy born to do art, nothing else. And he knew it. He never questioned it. He never doubted himself, never said, I don't know if I'm talented enough. He knew he had a gift, and he gave his entire life to it. Every single day of his working life, he averaged 3 art pieces a day. Painting never bored him. Socializing did, and quickly. He reinvented himself constantly. Blue period, rose period, African period, analytic cubism, synthetic cubism, neoclassicism, surrealism. No artist in history changed their style as many times as he did. But this wasn't ADHD novelty seeking. This was, let me show you how good I am. It's like a singer saying, I can do gospel, country, pop, hip hop, R&B, classical, soul, all of it. Watch me. He was someone who was full of himself, and justly so. A genius and kind of an asshole at the same time. When he mastered something, he moved on to the next thing. Quote, I do not seek, I find. He wasn't bewildered by his own brain. He was bragging. He was a night owl. He couldn't start before the afternoon, and he would paint until 3 or 4 a.m. This could be ADHD. He had an obsessive, all-consuming focus when he was working. That could be ADHD too. But the thing about ADHD hyperfocus is when someone with ADHD hyperfocuses on one thing, everything else tends to fall apart. Picasso was financially savvy. He kept his eyes on things outside art, and he was good at them when he wanted to be. He just usually didn't want to. His relationships were intense and passionate at the start, and then he would withdraw. He had at least 7 major romantic partners throughout his life. He had 2 wives, countless mistresses. 2 of his exes died, but one had a nervous breakdown. That tells you something about how little he cared about the people around him. That's not ADHD. ADHDers care too much. We people please. We say yes and regret it. We feel rejection like a physical blow. Picasso didn't have any of that. He just said no to everything that wasn't art. He never wrote a will, which became a whole thing for his family after his death. And I think that connects to the same thing, not caring. So, did Picasso have ADHD? Maybe some pieces fit, but would he have benefited from an ADHD diagnosis? Not by a mile, not even a little. A diagnosis helps someone who cares about what their life is like for themselves and the people around them. Picasso genuinely did not care about any of that. He cared about art. That's it. And there are people like him that still exist today. People who get diagnosed and don't do anything with it because the diagnosis was never going to change anything for them. Not everybody benefits from a diagnosis. Picasso is that guy. John Lennon hated school. His teachers described him as having no interest whatsoever. He once got 3 detentions in a single day. He was obviously smart. He passed entrance exams with minimal studying. But instead of doing classwork, he spent his time creating an ongoing comic series that mocked his teachers and fellow students. He was shoplifting, bullying, fighting. He had dyslexia. Because of it, he couldn't read sheet music. So he learned music entirely by ear. He couldn't memorize other people's lyrics, but he could write incredibly creative lyrics himself. He had serious childhood trauma. His father abandoned him. His mother couldn't take care of him, and he was removed from her and placed with his aunt and uncle. And think about that for a second. There's a lot of parents that are not going to manage taking care of their kids, but there's not a ton of kids that get removed from their parents, right? The only times they get removed from their parents is when the kid is really struggling to take care of themselves. If they took him out of her care, that tells you something about how much he was struggling. Then his uncle, who became his father figure, died. Then his mother died. All of this before he was 18. He was emotionally volatile for his entire life. He had major mood swings. He himself admitted that he has a thing with hitting women, and that it's because he had serious issues expressing his emotions. He had a difficult, explosive personality. He desperately needed structure from other people. That was a constant pattern throughout his life. Without someone else holding the framework together for him, everything in his life fell apart. He once said, "I've always needed a drug to survive." And he meant all of them. Amphetamines, weed, LSD, heroin, alcohol, cocaine, probably others. This is actually extremely common with undiagnosed ADHD. People who don't know what's going on with their brains will use whatever works. And it works for a sec. His first marriage was just continuous infidelity. With Yoko, he swung the other way. He was so obsessive and insecure that he wouldn't let her leave his sight. He had her go with him everywhere he went, including to the bathroom. That's anxious attachment taken to an extreme. He would only write when the spirit moved him or when there was a huge deadline and he really had to. He would go through bouts of nonstop writing for a week or two when an album was due, and then just do nothing. All of the time before, all of the time after. That's very ADHD. Everything was all or nothing. He had constant imposter syndrome and needed people to keep telling him that he was good. John Lennon. In my opinion, John Lennon had ADHD, and he absolutely would have benefited from a diagnosis, but not just a diagnosis. He would have benefited from a treatment plan. His ADHD made everything harder for him. It made it harder to regulate himself. It made it harder to cope with everything that was happening to him. But the ADHD didn't make him angry. It didn't make him anxiously attached. It didn't make him violent. It had something to do with it, but those are things that need their own attention. And this is something that a lot of people don't realize. Most people get an ADHD diagnosis and see it as the finish line. Maybe they go to therapy, maybe they get meds, but for someone like John Lennon and many others, the diagnosis is just the starting line. After that, you need a plan. The emotional dysregulation, the anxious attachment, the anger, each one of these needs its own specific work. These are things that John Lennon saw in himself as inevitable, just who he was. They weren't. They were treatable, and they don't get resolved just because you get the diagnosis or medication or therapy. They get resolved when you actually work on them. Marilyn Monroe had significant childhood trauma. Her mom was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia when Marilyn was 7. She never knew her dad. She spent her childhood bouncing between foster homes and an orphanage. She was sexually abused by her guardians at least twice. She got married at 16 just to avoid staying in state custody. As a child, she coped by going to the movies. She would go to the movies and stay the entire day there. She felt like it was an escape from the grim world she was living in. She was an amazing writer when she was writing for the school paper, but otherwise, a mid student. She had dyslexia, which often comes alongside ADHD. She also had childhood stutter, which can be suggestive of neurodivergent wiring. She was chronically late to everything, from the start of her career until the very end.
The late Marilyn Monroe.
She once said, quote, "I am invariably late for appointments, sometimes as much as 2 hours. I've tried to change my ways, but The things that make me late are too strong and too pleasing. That is so ADHD. And her lateness was mostly due to anxiety and perfectionism. She would spend hours getting ready. She would change her clothes multiple times. She would put a whole face of makeup on, remove it, and do a completely different look. Start over and over again. She would write down conversation topics ahead of time whenever she went anywhere, so she'd always have something to say. She was terrified of coming off stupid. So she had perfectionism, performance anxiety, and imposter syndrome, all at the same time. All extremely common in ADHD, especially in women. She could never memorize her lines. On Some Like It Hot, she reportedly needed 59 takes to do one scene where her only line was, "It's me, sugar." She was hard to work with. No shows, demanding, a nightmare on set by most accounts. But here's what's interesting. She loved photo shoots. In photo shoots, she was brilliant, spontaneous, in control. The difference? Photo shoots are in the moment. There's no script. There's no someone else's timeline. When Marilyn could be spontaneous and react in real time, she was phenomenal. When she was forced to follow someone else's script on someone else's schedule, she would fall apart. That's not being difficult. That's an ADHD brain. She had devastating, chronic, lifelong insomnia. So bad that in the mornings, her makeup artist would come into her bedroom and start doing her makeup while she was still asleep. I wish, right? Wouldn't that be nice? She started taking medications at 17 or 18, not to party, but to sleep. Then to stay awake, then to sleep, and so on and so forth. She had 3 failed marriages and a huge fear of abandonment. She was anxiously attached, desperately lonely. Throughout her life, she was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, paranoid personality, bipolar disorder. Even after she died, people retroactively diagnosed her with autism. She was given medications for everything. None of it worked. In my opinion, Marilyn Monroe had severe undiagnosed ADHD. And the proof is right there. She was diagnosed with a dozen different things, given meds for them, given treatment for them, and none of it worked. That's because they were treating the wrong thing. This is the classic story of a woman who was never given the right diagnosis. And she's not the only one. This is still happening today. Diana Spencer always felt different her whole life. Quote, "I always had this thing inside me that I was different. I didn't know why." She had an unstable childhood. Her parents divorced at a time when nobody's parents got divorced. She didn't get a lot of hugs. She felt like a nuisance, a disappointment. She believed she was stupid. That feeling never left her. She was always late for everything, from childhood until the day she died. She was a prankster, always looking for trouble. She almost got expelled at 11 because someone dared her to do something, and she thought, why not? Life's so boring. In the dorms with friends, she was loud, wild, full of energy. In class, she was silent. She never raised her hand because she didn't think she knew the answers. She liked school. She actually enjoyed English and history, but the exams made it impossible. She took her finals 5 times. She didn't pass once. She never got above a D. But when there were essay questions, she wrote 10 times as much as she should have. Quote, "It just came out of the pen." The knowledge was in there. A structured test locked it up in a way. An open page and a pen, and it flowed. That specific pattern does show up with people with ADHD and also in people with dyslexia and other learning differences. She excelled in art, music, and athletics. She won awards for diving and swimming, but academically, she dropped out at 16 after failing everything. She genuinely believed she was stupid. She was a perfectionist. She took criticism incredibly hard, always trying not to let anybody down, always pretending to be fine. Quote, "Nobody helped me at all. They'd be there to criticize me, but never to say well done." That's rejection sensitivity. When your brain takes everyday criticism or disappointment and turns it into a massive emotional reaction. It shows up a lot in ADHD, but it can also come from trauma. She developed bulimia the week she got engaged. Her fiance put his hands on her waistline and made a comment about her body. She was 19, anxious, overwhelmed. She found something that felt like a release. Women with ADHD are 3.6 times more likely to develop bulimia or binge eating disorder. Food is stimulating. It fills a gap. And SSRIs and stimulants have actually been proven to help with bulimia. After her first son was born, she experienced postpartum depression and anxiety. She was isolated, unsupported, and drowning in a life she wasn't prepared for. Women with ADHD are significantly more likely to experience postpartum depression and anxiety. She tried to get help. She was told to shut up. She was told what she thought didn't matter. She said, "But now I think it's good to be the oddball." In my opinion, Diana Spencer had ADHD, and she would have benefited enormously from a diagnosis. It would have helped her understand she wasn't stupid, that she wasn't a failure. It might have made the bulimia less likely, the depression less crushing, the anxiety less constant. She might have felt less aimless. She might have found her voice sooner because Diana had fire. She stood up for people with AIDS when nobody would touch them. She walked through minefields. She fought for people who were suffering, but she never turned that energy toward herself. She never said, "I deserve better," with the same force that she said, "These people deserve better." If she had known about ADHD, she might have had something personal to stand behind, a cause that was about people like her. And that might have changed everything about how she moved through the world. Less passive, more active, less chaste, more standing her ground. Maybe, just maybe, the audacity of chasing her through the streets of Paris wouldn't have existed. Maybe it could have saved her life. Who knows? But either way, she would have benefited from it. And I honestly believe that. Albert Einstein has been a loner since childhood. Not in a sad way. He just preferred being alone, daydreaming, imagining stuff, being lost in his own head. He was kind of prone to temper tantrums, especially as a kid. So that's emotional dysregulation. Extremely common with ADHD. He was imaginative in a way that's hard to overstate. Everything he came up with, all of those complex physics theories, started as pictures and little films playing in his mind. His creative imagination is what made it all happen. A strength of his mind was juggling a variety of ideas simultaneously, which is very ADHD. People with ADHD have a ton of thoughts running at the same time, all the time, and a really hard time explaining how we got from A to B. Einstein was the same way. When he was asked how he got to the theory of relativity, he basically said, I don't know, quote, "There were so many hidden complexities to motivate my thought." So as I said, he thought in pictures. Words came after. Quote, "A thought comes and I may try to express it in words afterwards." He loved finding patterns. It was like an obsession. Music helped him think, and throughout his life, he held on to this childlike sense of wonder. He found that extremely important. Quote, "I believe love is a better teacher than a sense of duty." School was a disaster. He couldn't just sit there and memorize things. He hated exams. He was terrible at note-taking and at attending lectures and classes. He was either kicked out of high school or asked to leave. It's unclear. When he didn't like a class, he just wouldn't show up. He always did something different than what his teachers or professors told him to do. That's just who he was. Despite the rumors, he never failed math. He was a genuine savant, far beyond what school required. But he still graduated college near the bottom of his class. He hated authority, hated dogma. He was a huge skeptic. He was resistant to received wisdom, and he never hid his feelings about any of it. He loved challenging people in power. Like, he genuinely enjoyed it. He had massive justice and injustice sensitivity, which is something a lot of people with ADHD have. A lot of people thought he had issues with empathy, but that wasn't true. They assumed that because he was aloof and rebellious. That's actually something a lot of people with ADHD deal with, being misread as cold when you're anything but. When he tried to get a job in academia and no one would hire him, he said he'd been suddenly abandoned by everyone. That's rejection sensitivity. He only enjoyed work when it was fully diversified, when he could do something different every day, every hour. Otherwise, he hated it. He dismissed a temp job at an insurance agency as an 8-hour day of mindless drudgery. He ended up working at a patent office, which gave him a ton of different things to work with, and it really worked for him. He got to do an 8-hour 8-hour workday in like 2 to 3 hours, and then the rest of the day he got to do whatever he wanted. He openly admitted that he lacked the natural aptitude to deal with people in any like official capacity. He rejected any kind of even lightly administrative role. His most administrative thing that he's ever done was hire a family member to do clerical tasks for him. He would forget to eat so routinely that it was his wife's job to come and get him to the table. For someone considered the greatest mind of all, he needed someone to manage every practical aspect of his life. Someone to pack for him, someone to handle his money, someone to handle his schedule, someone to handle his meals, and of course, someone to tell him when to eat. There were papers piled up everywhere. He was clean enough, sure, but orderly? No. He was endlessly patient with scientific problems, but so impatient with personal or emotional stuff. That gap is so ADHD, it hurts. He would travel places and completely forget personal items, sometimes literally his own luggage. And when someone would ask him, okay, what do you need me to bring? He would just be like, stationery, writing materials. That's it. That is so ADHD. One time he got an honorary PhD in the mail, and he thought the mail looked kind of weird, so he just threw it in the trash. He would drift aimlessly in a boat for like hours, and he kept getting lost over and over and over again. He didn't learn a thing. They kept having to rescue him. He would hide a notepad under the tablecloth when he would do official proceedings because he knew he would get bored and he wanted to be able to work on his equations. If someone was nice to him, he could never say no to them. He was a huge people pleaser. He was also quick to say yes to obligations and commitments before even thinking about it or finding out what they really were. Always regretted it. He would have scheduled obligations and he would just wave them off because he would be in the middle of a conversation. He would be in the middle of a conversation that was interesting to him and just lose track of time. And now this is more interesting than whatever he had to do. It doesn't matter what he had to do. Nobel schmobel. He fell for women and gravitated towards people in general who were intense in emotions and intellect. That's what drew him in more than anything. He actually dabbled with inventions as a hobby, like throughout his life. And he even came up with really good ideas for devices, but he never actually got them to be made because he was like, I'm done. He could manage a scientific breakthrough and a bitter divorce at the exact same time, no problem. He couldn't handle a small visit with his son without it falling apart over something minor. He took boyish glee in saying whatever he felt, regardless of consequences. For him, the freedom to speak impulsively was one of life's greatest pleasures, and his daily routine was loose and self-directed. He got up whenever, he would do things his own way. That's the only thing that actually worked for him. And he said about himself, quote, I have no special talents. I'm only passionately curious. Yes, he had ADHD. Would he have benefited from an ADHD diagnosis? I think he would have, because there were enough things in his life where he suffered from his ADHD. He was disorganized. He had issues with emotions and with dealing with them. He had issues with impulsivity that he didn't like. A lot of people think that getting treatment for ADHD is something that would take away from what's unique and special about you, from your brain capabilities and capacities. I think if anything, he probably would have done a lot more. He would have changed the world even more. And yet, he did pretty well. I like to think he did pretty well for himself, so hey. Every single one of these people was brilliant. Some of them might have had ADHD, some of them definitely did. But what I want you to take away from this is that the brilliance was never the problem. The suffering was. And for the ones who had ADHD, a diagnosis wouldn't have made them any less brilliant. It would have made their lives less painful.